Welcome to the Tales of American History for a special Lincoln's Birthday podcast. This is the second in a series of new podcasts for the Witnessing History Education Foundation, where we are educating Americans to understand the history of their country and of other countries so that they will appreciate the value of America's unique free institutions. I am your host, Genevieve Brown, appearing today with Kent Masterson Brown, the president of the Witnessing History Education Foundation, and today's guest, Steve T. Phan, the chief of interpretation at Camp Nelson National Monument in Nicholasville, Kentucky. Become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org, the website of the Witnessing History Education Foundation. View for free the Foundation's documentary films on the website and on the Foundation's YouTube platform. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. You can listen to the podcast on YouTube as well. View also the Foundation's free teacher education materials that conform to grade-level education standards at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook and Twitter. Now, take a journey back through time with Kent Masterson Brown and his guest, Steve T. Phan, and let their storytelling transport you to the most compelling moments in America's history. Steve is a park ranger and historian at the Civil War Defenses of Washington. He currently serves as the acting chief of interpretation at Camp Nelson National Monument in Nicholasville, Kentucky. He has worked at Richmond National Battlefield Park, Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, Stones River National Battlefield, Rock Creek Park, and the Buffalo Soldiers National Monument. A military scholar of the Civil War era, Phan's research focuses on military occupation, operational command, and fortifications during the Civil War. He's also the author of articles about Asians and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War, and on the defenses of Washington, which he's written for numerous publications. He was nominated for the National Park Service Tilden Award for Excellence in Interpretation in 2019. He holds a master's degree in American History from Middle Tennessee State University. Welcome, Steve. We're delighted you are here today.
Steve, we've introduced you, but let me make a personal welcome to you here at our podcast. It's a delight to have you. And your reputation has preceded you. I don't know whether that's all good or what, but I'm just kidding. It has, with your car and what have you, it certainly is noticeable, and also your scholarship has been terrific. So welcome. I'm thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's an honor to be with you. Genevieve, who I met for the first time. She's incredible. And to be in Kentucky. I call it Civil War, Kentucky. And it's thrilling to be here. And you are correct on both fronts. Famous, notorious, a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Well, you know, you've done a lot of things, Steve, and you've been at a lot of different parks in the national park system. And you're now at Camp Nelson. And that's really where I think I would like to concentrate today. As you probably are aware, there was a camp established in 1861 just down the road and across the Kentucky River from Camp Nelson, this being Camp Dick Robinson. And that's where General, who would become General, at least then he was Lieutenant Bull Nelson, got his start in the war, and that is recruiting troops. But why I bring that up is that Camp Dick Robinson is just down the road, maybe 10 miles at the most, from Camp Nelson. It's the road that Camp Nelson and Camp Dick Robinson are on, which is US 27 now. And that road ran literally from Zanesville, Ohio, all the way to Florence, Alabama during the Civil War and in the years before. And of course, when you have a road like that, which is a macadamized turnpike, you want to protect it. So it's a long way of asking you a question about the formation of Camp Nelson, its original purpose, and how would you characterize its original purpose given that road?
That's a great question, Kent. And I think you're spot on with this. It's the communication and supply routes for the Army moving forward, the Federal Army. And I've been calling Camp Nelson a forward operating base. Hey, we were talking about operations, Kent, before this interview here, and that's what we have here. When General Ambrose Burnside is sent to the west with the elements of the 9th Corps, and he'll be assigned the reorganized Department of Ohio, he's going to create what he calls the 23rd Corps, and the 23rd and the 9th Corps form the new Army of the Ohio, the one that I think that we think about the Army of the Ohio under Don Carlos Beale, but this is a new iteration of this department, and he's tasked with, first and foremost, occupying and controlling East Tennessee, which had been a mission for the Lincoln administration and the War Department for the first 2 years of the war. And so he takes command of the department in late March of 1863. And by the end of April, he tells his engineers to, select the basically supply base or area where we can form a supply depot south of Lexington between Hickman Creek and the Kentucky River. And that's what the engineers find, this very formidable ground where they're really protected on almost 3 sides. And they're going to build this supply base, and it's going to be quite massive, close to 5,000 acres by the end of the Civil War, with dozens and dozens of buildings. And, from this point, moving forward in 1863, he's going to launch his offensive into East Tennessee and capture Knoxville, in conjunction with General Rosecrans' movement towards Chattanooga. So first and foremost, I see this, Kent, as a forward operating base. You can move men and supplies to Camp Nelson, and from there, you can shift things towards East Tennessee and then further points into the south, even parts of western Virginia as well. And you're going to see some cavalry raids and things like that that will occur over the next 2 years.
Yeah. It also, just below Camp Nelson, of course, is the Kentucky River. And the Kentucky River, for all of us Kentuckians, is a spectacle to see, really. Its palisades are just gigantic. I don't know of any other river in America that looks like them. But you've got those giant palisades, of course, which make it utterly impregnable from any attack from or venture into central Kentucky from the south.
Indeed.
Except for the fact there was a bridge there just below Camp Nelson. And it was an old Lewis Wornwag bridge is what they called them back then. It had 2 diagonal or angular trusses that came out from either side of the river, holding the bridge up. It was made entirely of pine and poplar wood. It was built in 1838, but it was the only span beyond Frankfort of the Kentucky River. And so you've got that to contend with. If an invading force comes in, they got a bridge. So you want to command the bridge. You also want to command it for purposes of making sure whatever you do at Camp Nelson gets across the river or down into Tennessee and wherever you're going. But it is interesting that corridor, when Camp Dick Robinson was formed in 1861, Bull Nelson not only recruited and trained Kentucky regiments there, infantry regiments and an artillery battery, but also East Tennessee troops. So you've got the East Tennessee thing in 1861 on that turnpike, just like you do when Camp Nelson was formed.
Absolutely. And I find that's one of the things I've found quite compelling. So I'm still doing research. I've been in Kentucky for about a month now, coming from Washington, D.C., and I see some similarities with some of the camps that sprung up in Washington, D.C., obviously the building of the fortifications around the northern and eastern section of the camp, very much like the defenses of Washington. And yeah, you're right. They got the recruitment because I think a lot of people focus on, as they should, in 1864, the establishment of black regiments, United States
Oh, yeah.
colored troops in at Camp Nelson, excuse me. But we were doing research to try to basically do an order of battle of all the regiments that were organized at Camp Nelson.
Uh-huh.
And you're right, Kentucky regiments, and then regiments from East Tennessee as well. And then, the camp also became a refugee camp, not only for enslaved African Americans, the men and the women and their families. A lot of them will enlist with the United States colored troops. But there were refugees from East Tennessee that fled to central Kentucky during the Civil War.
Yeah.
So you really see all angles of the Civil War here.
Yeah, you do. You do. Let me ask you to do this. A lot of people may have passed Camp Nelson in the car who are Kentuckians or from around this part of the world. But there are probably a lot of people who are going to listen to this podcast who have never been here. And what you are now the historian for Camp Nelson National Monument. And would you just kind of describe for people what it looks like today? Are there earthworks still in existence? Any buildings that date to the war era? Just a brief description of what it looks like so they may decide to go and take a look.
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I'm glad you asked that, Ken. First and foremost, this is on behalf of the National Park Service. We'd like to commend and thank Jessamine County and the Camp Nelson Foundation for the work they've done over the last 20 to 30 years of, acquiring the land around where the camp was at. And then within the past, 15 or so years, they've established a visitor center there, another building called the Barracks Building, which is a replicated barracks building, which they would have had at Camp Nelson during the Civil War. And so when this was established as a national monument through the Antiquities Act in late 2018, this became a national park site. But we're still in partnership with Jessamine County for 3 years, and that agreement will end at the end of the fiscal year in September of this year. And so, without the support, obviously, and the foundation, this site would not be here. This would not be a national monument site. So we're very grateful for this opportunity to, kind of build this up from a really wonderful county site to a national monument as a part of the National Park Service. So I mentioned those two buildings here. There is a historic structure, which I know you've seen before. I'm sure you've been inside, Kent, the so-called White House, which was used as officers' quarters during the Civil War. It's been in better condition, so we're in the process of renovating the structure as we speak. And I know the superintendent will hear this conversation, Ernie Price. You know what got me out here? The earthworks. There are earthworks out here. And so I figured that's what brought you out here. That's what I've been, this is what was my great attraction. This was, I was the bee and this is the honey. This is what brought me out here. Because I had friends, my earthwork friends tell me, they're like, there are earthworks out. There's dirt. And you're going to really enjoy this site. So, there are remnant rifle pits. There's a reconstructed site that the county did under the direction of Dr. Stephen McBride, Fort Putnam. And off on the eastern section of the park, off in the woodline there's these incredible period earthworks, including Fort Jones. These were built by impressed enslaved African Americans. And I was in shock when I saw what some of the building material was. In D.C., they cut down trees and they excavated the dirt and, built up these earthworks, these earthen walls, which they have done at Camp Nelson. But, if you go off into the woods there's a lot of stone around, so and rock, and they basically built these revetments, the interior of the walls, with stone. And I had not seen that in many other places related to the Civil War. So these are absolute gems. And there's a couple what they called stone forts along the eastern side of the park as well. They look more like rifle pits to me, but they're actually in very good condition. So we've got a lot of unique cultural resources around the park. You were talking about what's left from the Civil War. The majority, almost all the buildings, of course, other than the White House, were destroyed or taken down in March of 1866 when the camp was closed. So it really is like an archaeological type landscape, right? And Dr. McBride's done a lot of, excavations and things like that over the years. So, we're going to use modern technology, photography, digital media, and things like that to basically connect all visitors to the historic landscape. That's our goal.
Wow. And as you're driving down US 27, this site is just below the town of Nicholasville, about 10 miles or so. And as you're driving down and you look off to the left where the park is, you can see the earthworks from the road. I mean, Fort Jackson?
That's right.
And then Fort Pope. You can see those, and you have them marked by yellow flags, I think they are.
That's correct.
And it's again, you can just see it. And of course, all those earthworks are on the north end of the fort of the camp, because they don't have the big palisades protecting them on that side, right?
Well, what a formidable position and a natural position, right? I think it was pretty clear why Major Simpson, the chief engineer of the Department of Ohio, chose that site. I mean, if we can only fortify one section of this camp here, we've got the natural, ground with the palisades there. I mean, no one's going to breach those.
No.
And I think you're right. I'm still trying to read up on this. You talk about that wooden bridge across the creek there, or the river. Was that fortified at all?
Well, they would have had troops positioned on the south bank of the Kentucky River to protect it, and then troops positioned there at the north bank. But it was at its time the longest wooden cantilever bridge in America.
Wow!
And again, it's the only thing that crossed the Kentucky River anywhere, save at Frankfort. And so naturally, you got to protect it, but it also provides you with access to move equipment, supplies across the the Kentucky River, and to deliver them where you want in Tennessee and elsewhere, and where the armies are fighting.
Which makes a lot of sense, because whenever there were threats against the camp in '63 and '64. The commanders of the camp always sent troops to the bridge because they knew that's where they would be coming from, and obviously they would gather the men to protect the or operate or man the earthworks as well. But that all makes sense.
Wouldn't John Hunt Morgan love to have set fire to that bridge?
Yes, he would have, absolutely. So we're going to be mentioning his name quite a bit, and so it's interesting. I did graduate school, as mentioned in my biography, at Middle Tennessee State in Murfreesboro. Yeah. So, I did almost 3 years of study on the Army of the Ohio, Cumberland, and, operations in this area into Kentucky. And all I heard was John Hunt Morgan blowing up railroads and tunnels and just being a thorn in the side of federal authorities for like 3 years.
Yeah. He'd have loved taking that bridge down. That would have been another feather in his cap.
Yes, and he had a lot of feathers. So
he certainly did.
It would have been quite the headdress for John Hunt Morgan.
Yeah. Well, let's move forward in the story of Camp Nelson to. I think Grant made a visit out here on his way east, moving in January 1864. I think he made a recommendation that they close it down.
That's correct. Yeah, and then Sherman had thoughts on it as well. I mean, as well as it was positioned defensively and then even strategically. I mean, the route to East Tennessee was just so difficult. For men and material, obviously horses and mules and things like that, it was just hard to carry enough supplies to get troops into East Tennessee. Yeah. So I think the idea was potentially to really close the camp, but the large influx of formerly enslaved people really shifted kind of the role of the camp from, a forward operating base and a kind of supply center for forward movement to a concentration camp for enslaved people, and then a recruitment camp for African-American soldiers as well.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it not General Sherman that first made the suggestion that be turned into a camp for to recruit African American?
I'm trying to recall the exact account of who thought about that. I can't recall if it's Sherman or I know a person that had a great influence on it was Lorenzo Thomas, the Adjutant General of the U.S. Army. He was involved with that as well.
Yeah, Sherman, as you know, briefly occupied Camp Dick Robinson.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. He was in command of this, where he wasn't he a part of the Department of Ohio until he after Robert Anderson, correct?
Yes, exactly. And right after Robert Anderson, and so he was in the Richard Robinson house down there on US 27, just below Camp Nelson, and he would have known.
Absolutely,
he would have known, and it's a good segue into the story of the African Americans at Camp Nelson, which is its huge story. Tell the viewers, listeners rather, how this transformation came about from a pure supply depot to a camp for recruitment and training of African American soldiers.
Well, Kent, as you know, with Civil War Kentucky, everything is complicated here, right? And I am finding that more and more as I read. I mean, I thought being in D.C. was complicated and reading about the Civil War in the Capitol, which of course it is. It reminds me a little bit of Maryland during the Civil War, right?
A little bit.
Because the idea that it was a border state and it's, directly kind of connected to federal infrastructure. And so I've really that's really being unveiled to me as I dive deep into the history here. And just like parts all over the country here, where there were federal troops en masse, enslaved African Americans came into federal lines, right? This next step and this idea of emancipation, no matter how soluble it was, and in many ways it was, and we will see that at the camp, there's really not this idea. I mean, this idea of stepping into freedom doesn't really happen. It's steps towards emancipation, which is very difficult and it's often taken away. Yeah. And so it becomes, a contraband camp in many ways or a refugee camp, and the numbers absolutely explode. I think the big issue with Kentucky was the fact that it was a border state and that it was it was a union state, so federal laws did apply, including the Fugitive Slave Act. Right. So this idea of, especially with the issue of the Emancipation Proclamation, which does not touch the border states, especially Kentucky, how can you raise black troops in a state that's not in rebellion, right? And that was the really big issue. Yeah. And it's just going to go through many iterations, and this will go all the way up to the War Department. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, will be involved as well. Right. And by, kind of spring of 1864 is when things will change. Yeah. And from the idea of first, we'll compensate the slave owners. Two, we will recruit black troops, but they can only be trained in other states. Yeah. Two, actually, you know what? Military necessity calls for us to raise troops in Kentucky. We'll arm and clothe them now, and then we'll kind of go from there. Yeah. And so that's going to be the start. And Ken, over the course of the Civil War, 10,000 men were recruited here. Yeah. Perhaps the third, we believe, largest recruitment camp in the country behind Philadelphia and New Orleans. That's massive. That has quite the impact of the Civil War to show the importance of this site. And we're not only just talking about the men, of course. They're joined by women and young children by the thousands. Yeah. And so this becomes, as I said, a refugee camp. And so the Army, as they had done across the country, will start providing infrastructure for these formerly enslaved people. You're going to see a couple schools and churches pop up, but also structures where they can find employment to support the Union war effort through the duration of the war.
It's interesting. In 1863, when this camp really kind of comes about, you have a lot of African Americans laboring to build all those fortifications that we can still see out there.
Absolutely. And, the interesting thing about that is they were not compensated. Their owners were compensated.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
they were actually impressed. You know what this reminded me of, Ken? And I know you know the story. Fort Negley in Nashville,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Obviously, during the midst of the Heartland Campaign, the federal armies will impress enslaved people to build these earthworks or even fortifications around the city of Nashville.
Right.
That's what you're going to see at Camp Nelson as well.
Yeah.
So we know the earthworks built around the camp on the northern and eastern section are built by enslaved labor.
Right.
And it was the so-called loyal owners that were compensated, right?
Yeah.
So that adds like another element of the story here.
Yeah, these military authorities are operating under the Confiscation Act of 1861, where the military had the absolute right to deny a property owner of his property for military use, and if in the place where they're operating, a slave is considered property, then you can deny that property owner of his property.
Right.
And so this is where I take it they're getting them, plus those who have basically refugeed into what was becoming Camp Nelson. So they get them in two ways. But then even if they refugee in there, they've got to have some legitimate reason why they can keep them there and use them. And they're taking these acts, like the Confiscation Act, to do so.
Absolutely. I think, Ken, as we Civil War historians, we hear this term quite a bit, and we know it's a very vague term, right? Mm-hmm. Military necessity.
Right.
And that will ebb and flow, and that will evolve in many different ways, even in the same place that you're at, right? And so I think one of the tragic stories that we have that we will highlight at Camp Nelson is the famous or infamous Expulsion Story.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Right? And so, if you read about these so-called contraband camps or even army bases around parts of the country, it really depended on who the commander was of the camp about how African Americans would be received as they came into the lines. So, in late 1864 and during the wintertime, there was what they called the expulsion, where well over 100 African Americans, mostly women and children, were basically sent away from the camp, and many of them died of, exposure. Mm-hmm. And it was a very dark, I think it's the darkest chapter of the history of the camp, and it's something that we have to really talk about and kind of embrace as a part of this very difficult, complex story of the Civil War.
Yeah, and it as you said, it is particularly complex in a state like Kentucky, where it's a slave-owning state, 250,000 slaves in a 3 million population when the war began, the census of 1860, and you've got people here who ally themselves with the Confederacy because they may be slave owners, they may have a particular political interest in that or an economic interest in siding with the 11 Confederate states, or they may side with the Union because of the commercial effect of them not doing that. But the interesting thing about it is they both may be slave owners.
Right. Ken, I wanted to ask you about this so we can kind of flesh it out a little bit. So I was talking to a local historian. He worked for the Park Service for a bit. He's got a PhD and works in, if I know I'm pronouncing this probably incorrectly, Louisville.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting there. All right, I'm a new transplant.
Named for King Lua.
Oh, King Lua. I see. Okay, that makes sense. It's all coming down to me now. Okay. He was talking to me about the reaction from white federal officers after the issue of the Emancipation Proclamation, and how there was mass resignation amongst members of the Army of the Cumberland. Mm-hmm. Do you recall coming across a lot of those accounts?
Oh yeah, because you even find it in the Army of the Potomac.
Okay, okay,
I can remember.
That's right.
I can remember reading memoirs and diaries of officers in the 20th Massachusetts Infantry. Now that's the Harvard regiment.
Yeah, the Harvard guys. That's right.
And they were resigning their commissions when the Emancipation was issued. And you go, what? I mean, this is bizarre. I mean, wouldn't they be the first ones in the ranks up there to eradicate slavery? They come to the war, they claim, because they wanted to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. And this is the 20th Massachusetts. So this is a civil war in its truest sense. It is everybody against everybody in some ways. If that's Massachusetts, imagine it in slave-owning Kentucky.
Exactly. I'm glad you made that comparison there, right? And wow.
There's a great story. One of the regiments raised at Camp Dick Robinson was the 1st Kentucky Cavalry, a Union command, of course. It had a distinguished record during the war. And its commander was Frank Wolford. And Frank was a really wild kind of character. The photographs of him make him look like he's just been on a 6-day bender, hair all over the place, just a wild-looking man. But he was an incredibly effective cavalry commander, regimental commander. He helped capture John Hunt Morgan, not Morgan himself, but much of Morgan's command, and up in Ohio. And but Frank was as loyal as you get until Lincoln issues the Emancipation. And Frank then is seen here in Lexington giving a speech at a place called Old Melodeon Hall, which still stands down on Main Street. I'll show it to you someday, Steve.
Can't wait to see it.
And the speech is a diatribe against Lincoln and the Emancipation. And, of course, he has a ready, willing audience cheering him on. Even though, half of these people from this town were Confederate, half of them were not.
Right.
And as a result, the Lincoln administration hears about this and orders his arrest. And so he's arrested and taken to Nashville. And eventually they release him because just his presence is worth a full brigade of cavalry. And so they release him. And it doesn't take long before the Lincoln administration accedes to allowing African Americans to join the Union ranks. Then he starts it again. And he's arrested. But here is one of the most prominent military figures in the Union Army in Kentucky. And this is what he does.
Wow.
Oh, and you can just imagine a lot of people who are just privates, sergeants, lieutenants,
right,
in the ranks, who have similar feelings. There are those who do not. But it is a civil war in its truest sense. And it's what makes it so difficult as someone interested in history like you and me to flesh out what each of these things mean.
Exactly. Yeah, it's never been – I think, that's why history is so complex, right?
It is.
And so when you see a figure like this gentleman you're talking about, I mean, willing to die for the Union, right?
Right. Well, absolutely.
But there were certain things that he certainly did not fight for, and he made his point heard against the detriment of his even career.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's a topic probably for another day with you and me, but it is certainly one that comes into play here with respect to Camp Nelson. When Lincoln issues his proclamation of emancipation in January of 1863, that only applied to slaves living in the Confederate States, right?
Right.
So it didn't apply to Kentucky because Kentucky wasn't a Confederate state. And
I would go even further, Kent. Even in the states in rebellion, if the Union Army isn't around, then good luck, right? where are you going to go, right?
Well, that's exactly right.
And I think Dr. Amy Taylor from the University of Kentucky really talks about this, the first steps towards the emancipation is towards the Union forces, either
Mm-hmm.
the Army or the Navy. And by the way, they might be in this town for a few months, but they could pull out,
Right.
depending on what happens with operations.
Right.
And that could be, for a lot of African Americans, the end of their first step towards emancipation, and they might be re-enslaved again,
Right.
or their status is unknown, and they have to kind of figure out the next step moving forward. And we definitely see that in Kentucky.
Oh, yeah. What's always, and Amy, by the way, is a great person. She's done a podcast with me before, too. And I love her book on slave camps. She's done some monumental work in that.
Absolutely.
And of course, for those of you who are listening and don't know Amy Taylor, she's a professor of history at the University of Kentucky here in Lexington. Let's kind of walk through from the emancipation. It becomes effective January 1. It only freed slaves in the Confederate states, the states in rebellion. Kentucky was not in rebellion, so it had fundamentally no effect here. However, that didn't stop African American slaves from cutting loose and trying to get to Camp Nelson, right?
Absolutely. And you're going to see this across the country, because we definitely see this in Washington, D.C., or the Army did.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, which was really interesting, because you see the contrast, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking the same with Tennessee and Kentucky, because from the Virginia perspective, if enslaved people were coming from Virginia, we'll take them in, right?
Right.
Because Virginia's in rebellion, and
Right.
they've been using these people against us, to build fortifications and things like that. And so the issue was Maryland. Maryland, again, was like Kentucky, a border state. There were enslaved people just slipping across the border into Washington, D.C., and it became a major issue. And you see this within the regiments themselves.
Right.
Because the so-called enslaver, or the slave owner, was allowed to come into camp to retrieve his so-called property, and many did that. The only issue was now they were, a lot of these, especially the men and young boys, were working for the Army, and so in many cases they were protected by the federal soldiers.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see a lot of tension between federal soldiers and the so-called, and then what they believed as secessionists. A lot of them considered all slave owners secessionists. That's Maryland. Can you imagine Kentucky, what that looked like?
Oh,
Right? As we talked about this idea of what exactly does loyalty mean? Well, you could be you could own dozens of people, even be against the federal government, but you could swear an allegiance to so-called the Union, and you'd be fine.
Yeah.
No one would touch you, right?
Yeah.
Especially once they were recruiting African Americans. But I think you make a great point, Kent. 1863, African Americans are just showing up to these federal encampments and outposts and things like that, and they're really pressing the Army, which is an extension of the federal government, to do something. Like, we're going to be here, so, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of this really interesting intersection between enslavement and emancipation, right? And the arm of the federal government, the Army, is having to deal with this on the ground. So, if you read what's going on in Kentucky, we don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
Each commander is trying to figure out, what do we do? Do we send these people away? Do I feed them? Do I hire them on to help us build for it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's all of this, and oh my goodness, it'll keep you researching this for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah, oh, it really will. And it gets even more complex as the deeper you get into this. Okay, the emancipation frees them in the Confederate States. The poor slaves in Kentucky, it's incredible, can't do anything about it, even though I think many of them tried to go into the Union ranks, which created a problem. But I bring this up because it's incredible. Amy Taylor and I talked about this too, rather extensively. Was that Lincoln proclaims the slaves free, but then what?
Exactly.
Then what?
Who's going to enforce this, right?
Where are they going to go?
Where are they going to go? What's going to happen next? What happens to the enslaved person in Kentucky compared to this enslaved person in Tennessee, right?
Yeah.
I know a line, this state line separates them. They're still both enslaved. The ones in Tennessee, hey, they're free, right?
They're better off. I mean,
Right.
to a degree.
Yeah, in the way they are. And
Yeah.
I think you're going to really see this issue in Kentucky, especially at Camp Nelson, as the commanders are trying to figure things out. From, as I said before, this idea of compensating the slave owners to, hey, we can recruit them, but we have to send them out of state, to finally in 64, no, we're going to recruit them here. We're going to organize them here. They can do occupation duties in Kentucky,
Right.
all along, the rivers and things like that, along the Tennessee border. And then other troops go and fight in Virginia. End up, in Mexico towards the end of the Civil War. So it's really interesting to see how quickly this evolves for African Americans. And the thing is, what happens next? And so that's one of the things we really focus on, and we will moving forward, Kent, is, the camp is around in the beginning of Reconstruction, right? So, the major hostilities end by 1865 or mid-65. But there are regiments that were organized in at Camp Nelson that are still in the field, that go out to Mexico and serve with Sheridan's armies, right?
Can you imagine?
Oh my God, a lot of those men were apparently, some of them mutinied because they're like, why are we on the Mexican border right now? With that whole incident, with the Emperor Puppet and all that stuff. And so the camp survives or is kept active until March of 1866. That's pretty late, right?
Yeah.
And it actually reminds me of the defenses of Washington a bit because the majority, I'd say about 20 of the forts were kept around until March of 1866. And the majority of them were garrisoned by black soldiers, which is pretty interesting.
It is.
And so you're going to see kind of the same thing. You're going to have these USCT troops from Camp Nelson out in different parts of the country. And then they're going to formally close the camp in March of 1866. And this is the most, I think, important aspect of this, Kent. When the army pulls out, they don't leave the structures here, right? They take everything down. Meaning all this infrastructure, you had the barracks, the hospital, these buildings which you would have worked in, these shops and things like that, kitchens, whatever, all those are going down because there's this idea, certainly promoted by the local white inhabitants, is we're not allowing some big black community to form up in this area where the camp used to be. And so you're going to have this really massive exodus of African Americans from this area once the camp was closed in 1866, including, Kent, the famous exodusters that go out to Kansas. There's going to be a lot of people that will cross the Ohio River into Ohio and start a new life after the Civil War. So there's a small community by the Fee Church, as you know, that will start this kind of freedmen's type of church led by this reverend who's there to educate African Americans and really build this kind of post-war free society. And it kind of ebbs and flows through the decades after the Civil War. But that's why, the landscape is so different now than it was during the Civil War. I mean, I can't imagine many buildings would have survived after the war, especially these army structures, but everything was taken down.
Yeah. I'm going to set something up here for our chat here. Right after the Emancipation became effective, the Edwin Stanton, and you mentioned this at the head of this talk, the War Department authorized the recruitment and training of African Americans right after the Emancipation became effective. So here you have the War Department saying, "Okay, sure, we can use you. You can come into the Army." And if they did, they would be emancipated from slavery in exchange for their military service.
Right.
And this is what, of course, set up Camp Nelson to become a training center and for Kentucky and recruiting center for United States colored troops. And then to answer the dilemma in Kentucky, where the emancipation didn't apply, Governor Thomas Bramlett agreed in 1864 that African American men in Kentucky could join the Army with consent of their owners who would be paid. And you mentioned this.
Right.
That they could be paid, what, $300 or something per slave. So we've got all that. Now Kentucky slaves, according to the state government, can do this. They can leave, go into the Army, et cetera, et cetera. But here's another thing that it always got me. The Lincoln administration never considered, what about the male slave's dependents? His wife, his children, what happens to them?
Right.
And
I think this is a question, Ken, you see across the areas where there are where there's federal occupation or outposts. I think as early as 1862.
yeah,
Because in 1862 we talk about the contraband decision at Fort Monroe with Benjamin Butler, right? And
yeah.
there's a trickle, and then there's a wave of enslaved people that come into federal lines. And some of them are sent up to Washington, D.C. to work on the fortifications around the Capitol.
Yeah.
And Ben Butler says, what about their families, their dependents?
Yeah.
And the War Department says, we don't want them up here. They're like, well, I can't, in good conscience, send up the men and leave the children and women, the families here, right? So how was that decided in Kentucky? Is that ever decided?
About the dependents?
Yes.
No. Bramlett's orders only directed itself toward men. Just like, the War Department said, oh, yeah, men, ex-slave men can come in the Army. Well, what about the women?
Right.
And Bramlett's just did not go far enough either. Bramlett, show you how Kentucky is so screwed up. Bramlett was elected governor in 1863 as a, quote, Union Democrat.
Okay. That's yeah.
What
Wow.
is that?
Right.
Since the idea of the Democrat with a big, large D before the Civil War meant you were a secessionist.
Right.
Here's a Union Democrat.
Would you say that he was aligned and politically with like Andrew Johnson? Is that a good comparison?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I think it's a good comparison,
Okay.
yeah. And the Lincoln administration really loved him. He raised a regiment of infantry when the war broke out. He's a well-known character. He actually was one of those who came in here and secreted the muskets out of Lexington to take to Camp Dick Robinson.
Oh, that famous story. So he was a part of that.
Oh,
huh?
yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
I see.
Yeah, so he's shown his Union stripes, but he was a slave owner, and the slave vote in this state was important to him, and so what a mix-up. But so his allows so long as the owner is compensated $300, the slave can be used by the Army.
And I'm trying to, because as I said, I'm still learning this myself. And so we've got the idea of compensation, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously by 64, that's going to change. What's going to cause that to change where the Army is just going to accept African Americans without compensating the owners?
Victories one after another in the West is going to do it, and in the East. It's just power. Having successfully exercised power. I think that's really the answer.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, that makes sense because obviously, definitely before, obviously 63 moving forward, it's like, hey, we're still having some issues with, some of our offensives and some of our campaigns across the country. But by 64, especially mid-64, there's going to be momentum for the federal armies and navies. Then that's where the power can come from the government to enforce kind of their own version of enlistment, correct?
Right, exactly. And these soldiers coming into Camp Nelson to be recruited and trained, who follows them? Their wives and children.
Of course.
And this is what sets up the problem that you talked about earlier. And that is you've got all these dependents of these soldiers. And what's Camp Nelson going to do with them? They refer to them as refugees.
Right. Yeah. I think that was. Can you imagine being the authorities and this idea of like,
no,
hey, we're enlisting your husband And can you imagine the husband saying, "Well, my family gets to stay at this camp while I go off and fight, correct?" Well, we're not
Yeah,
exactly sure
yeah,
about that, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and I mean, I'd love to hear you elaborate on this. The suffering of those wives and children. These are among those that Speed Fry, the commander of Camp Nelson, moved out.
That's right. Yes, and as I said, it was dependent on who the commander of the camp was,
Yeah,
right? Who had
right.
different ideas and depended on what troops came into camp, right? Because you
That's
can
right.
imagine there would be women and children like staying in some of the barracks if the army had moved on.
Right.
But there were so many units that came and went from the camp. They were thrown out, and eventually they were completely pushed out of camp.
Yes.
And so you're talking about people that are taking their first steps from enslavement to this idea of emancipation. They're coming into federal lines. They're exhausted. They're sick.
They're
They're
sick.
malnourished. They're
Right.
bundled together and exposed to disease.
Right.
And then you're going to throw them out of camp in the middle of winter. Well, what do you think's going to happen?
Yeah.
Right.
They're
And
going to die.
They're going to die, and it's going to be one of the most tragic events I think of the Civil War in many ways.
Yeah.
And because you're thinking about the men that joined the United States colored troops and are off to fight, and their families are left behind. And if their families are treated like this, what are the men at the front fighting for, right?
exactly.
And what are they thinking?
Yeah.
And so it's one of those moments that, as I said, we're not going to shy away from. It's going to be something that we will we'll talk about at all different angles and get people to the public to know this story and know these narratives, and hopefully we can learn something from it. That's our goal.
And Amy and I talked about this a lot, and that is the whole concept of refugees. Because her book is about refugee camps. There was no established system to take care of refugees. We've seen in modern times, you can see on the television whenever there's fighting is raging in Iraq or wherever the hell in the world it is, you see refugees
You
all the
do,
time,
indeed.
by the hundreds of thousands. And can you imagine the number of refugees the Civil War caused? The deeper Union armies penetrated into Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. They left streaming behind countless refugees. We in Lexington, we had a little girl who was an epileptic. She lived on Gratz Park, and she kept a diary during the war. And John Hunt Morgan's mother lived across the street.
Wow.
And she would watch who would come and go and
Okay.
record in this little diary of hers. But she says in this diary that the refugees streaming into Lexington off of the Richmond Road. This is the road to the town of Richmond, just south of, on the other side of the Kentucky River. And it was an endless stream day after day after day. And naturally it would be. I mean, the army and the war is displacing these people.
Mm-hmm.
And what do? They seek refuge far behind the lines of combat. They don't want to be in that.
Right.
So they keep going and they keep going. And so you have African American refugees, because in the Deep South, those slaves are being freed by these Union armies, but nobody's given them any shelter.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have whites as well,
Right.
in one mass groups coming into Kentucky. And what happens then? And in fact, one of the reasons in Kentucky that in 1864, we were ready to vote Lincoln out in Kentucky was because of the refugee problem. And it's the reason Kentucky's legislature voted to nullify the Emancipation Proclamation.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? Because of the fear of refugees.
And this is white and black refugees, correct?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, of all kinds.
So let me ask you, Kent, was there a difference between the way black refugees were treated compared to whites?
You know, I can't find any. people who are sick, in tatters. What do you do with any of them?
Right.
I asked Amy this once. I said, Amy, how many do you think died? Just died along the roads or in shanty camps where they got disease, just like happened at Camp Nelson, where you lost over 100 at one time when Speed Fry moved them all out. And those were dependents, mostly, of those poor soldiers.
Indeed.
But what do you do with just Mr. Refugee? White, black, doesn't matter. Who's going to take care of them? There's just nothing there. Nothing. And
I guess that's why you see, I think, a couple different things with this. The Army provides some sort of infrastructure in a way, don't they? Kent,
they do now.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Well, I think even back then, I understand that they're coming into these lines, but with the establishment of, places like Camp Nelson, the Army is there, and the Army is there in force, and the Army has the men and material to basically provide more opportunities for these people than they would have anywhere else, right? Especially escaping enslavement, because one of the stories about Camp Nelson, especially in 1865 into 66, is some of these organizations that are sent from the north to come and basically help these people in their next steps. Some of them are sent to northern cities, especially the women, to become like domestic laborers.
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of like the next step. Post-Civil War is, the movement of African Americans into some of these northern cities to do domestic labor work. And I guess I never made the connection that this started actually during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Because you think of, I'm sure, students of history, or even if you're in college, you hear about the Great Migration and the Second Great Migration in the early 1900s, but you don't really think about migration during the Civil War.
No.
For refugees, right?
No.
And I think that's going to be something that we're going to touch on.
I'll tell you, I think, Steve, it would be a terrific thing for you to touch on. I've read there are upwards of 1,300 refugees died at Camp Nelson of disease. And that wouldn't surprise me a bit. I mean, look at the road it's on.
Right.
It's a main boulevard out of the lower South. And, it's a huge issue to me. And I think it's a huge issue in the study of the war. It becomes a recruiting and training place for African American soldiers, United States colored troops, as they were referred to then. Tell us, if you would, the troops that were mustered or units that were created there, and where they went, where they fought.
Yeah. This is interesting, Kent. This is more complex than I thought it would be. I was just, when you think about United States colored troops, you immediately think about the infantry, right? The regiments, the enlisted regiments of infantry, and which will have at least 4 regiments of United States colored troops infantry here, most notably being the 114th and 116th. And you'll appreciate this, Ken. I'm sure your viewers as well. Before I came over here, I had a meeting with my colleagues in the National Park Service. Where at? Richmond National Battlefield Park, Petersburg National Battlefield, and Appomattox. Appomattox, right?
Yeah.
And so those units, both those units, they kind of took different routes to get to Virginia, but they ended up with the all-black Army of the James, the 25th Corps of the Army of the James. They're going to fight around Richmond and Petersburg, and they're going to end up at Appomattox. So we're actually working on a video that basically traces these 2 units at all these National Park Service units, which is exciting, right?
Wow.
Because I think the idea that there were so many of these regiments that did garrison duty, which they did, of course, but some of these units saw some heavy action.
Right.
And Ken, these were the same regiments that ended up in Louisiana and Texas in 1865, 1866. One of them mustered out in 1867.
Wow.
long after the Civil War.
Wow.
And then you can even make it even further. I talked to, and as your wife mentioned, I worked at Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers.
Yeah.
One of the units, I believe the 116th, 100 men from the regiment enlisted with the 9th U.S. Cav.
Is
And
that
then
right?
I also believe, and the 39th Infantry, these are what became known as the famous Buffalo Soldiers. These are the regular Army units that were created in 1866 when the regular Army was expanded after the Civil War.
Yeah.
So think about that. We also have some heavy artillery units, the 12th and 13th United States Colored
Right.
Heavy Artillery. The 12th, there's actually a reactivated living history
Yeah,
group
they're-
that we work with. I'm sure
Yeah.
you know them,
Yeah,
Kent.
they're really good chaps.
Oh, they're wonderful. And so we're very proud in the Park Service from Camp Nelson that, they're going to represent the Park Service at all these events. I'm fortunate to be the historic weapons advisor, so we'll be out shooting cannons at different events and at the park and things like that. And I want to talk to you more about this because I know you've got a deep knowledge of this. The 5th and the 6th U.S. Colored Cavalry. Cav.
Yeah.
Something that you don't hear about too much during the
No.
Civil War,
No.
especially the 5th. Saltsville and stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit more about them?
Well, all I know is that they served at Saltville under Stephen Burbridge.
That's right.
Burbridge, interestingly, he was the military governor of Kentucky during much of the war.
What a character, huh?
Yeah, he is the one who put a stop to Speed Fry removal of dependents out of Camp Nelson. And I think that was the one humane thing Burbridge did in his lifetime.
Wow.
He's the one who's been noted for executing Confederate prisoners of war. He'd have them draw straws whenever a Union picket was killed.
That's right.
He'd have them draw straws, and the guy who got the small straw wound up being taken out of a prison and shot.
He was known as the Butcher, correct?
The Butcher.
Wow.
And he became so, the state became so angry at him that when he moved out of here, but he was even afraid when he was living in Brooklyn, New York, his last years of his life, to stand in front of a lighted window at night for fear someone would see him and shoot him.
Wow.
But Burbridge at least did one good, humane thing, and that is he brought a stop to Camp Nelson's commander removing the dependents out of there after that horrible episode. But he commanded the Union force at Saltville, and the 5th and particularly the 5th United States Colored Cavalry was involved in that. And of course, sadly, again, were the victims of a massacre at the end of that. It's a tough war. It is a tough war.
Yeah, Ken, I was going to say, this reminds me of the work I did in graduate school, especially, so I focused on federal occupation of Middle Tennessee, all the way down to the Alabama border, right?
Yeah.
Because,
yeah.
as the Union Army shifts further south, they're setting up the garrison towns.
Right.
And as you know, the garrison might have half a regiment, a couple companies,
Right.
surrounded by hostile citizens, guerrillas.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of guerrilla activity from what I'm reading in Kentucky, correct? Especially
yeah.
near Camp Nelson. Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah. In Kentucky, it had its own civil war. Kentucky did.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't want to jump off on this tangent too much, but I think I was just reading in the ORs, we were talking about the official records before we got on the recording here, and I think it was an order from Speed Fry to one of his, I actually think it might have been Burbridge, telling one of his local commanders, he's like, if you capture these guerrillas, he's like, I don't want any of them alive, basically.
Yeah.
Like, keep no prisoners, right?
Yeah, right. And, of course, those who perpetrated the virtual execution of wounded United States colored troops at Saltville, at least the first battle of Saltville, were indeed executed for that outrage. But Camp Nelson has a phenomenal story, Steve, and It's one that I'm so happy has you.
Well, thank you, sir.
Working there. It's a place that needs to come out even more into the consciousness of folks in America around here, but also in America generally.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying consciousness. That's something that we're very much focused on. And then I guess I was going to say real quickly, and Mill Springs is now also a national park unit.
Yeah.
So we've got this Civil War heritage area, or this corridor of Civil War sites that can really, inspire people to learn more about the really deep complexities of this war, which we've been talking about for the past hour or so.
Yeah. And the Camp Dick Robinson site is there for people to see. The Richard Robinson House still stands right down the road from Camp Nelson. And then, of course, there's Perryville, the battlefield there, which I remember years ago when we started the commission to expand the battlefield. It was 99 acres, and I worked on that for about 11 years, but now it's nearly 3,000 protected acres. And that is crying out for an addition to the National Park Service. It's a spectacular place and looks today just as it did in 1862 when the battle was fought there. You're right. From Camp Nelson down is a corridor of Civil War history.
Let me ask you really quickly, Kent. I want to really get your insight on this. I guess I'm new to Kentucky. I spent 3 years in graduate school in Tennessee, but the more I dive in and just dig, and I just find just how complex and unique and dramatic Civil War Kentucky is. Why isn't Civil War Kentucky on the national consciousness as Virginia is, or South Carolina, or even Pennsylvania with Gettysburg, or Tennessee with Nashville and Stones River and Shiloh and things like that?
Well, I think it was simply the way the war was fought would be my answer to that. Naturally, the war was fought in the East, meaning Virginia, between the capital of the Confederacy, which became Richmond, Virginia, and the Union, the national capital at Washington. And the war was fought there. And of course, there's where the newspaper interest was, even to the exclusion of some of the great victories out in the West, like Shiloh and Vicksburg and Chickamauga and what have you, and Chattanooga. But nevertheless, the newspaper concentration was there. Those were the, quote, big battles to the news. In spite of the fact that some of the engagements in the West were every bit as large as Gettysburg, every bit as important as Gettysburg or Spotsylvania or the Wilderness or whatever, still the news concentrated in the East. So that is like in a place all by itself, the East, Virginia. And to this day, it's still battlefield heaven for those who want to visit Civil War battlefields.
Absolutely.
Only second to that comes states like Tennessee, and because major battles were fought there, Shiloh, Chattanooga, Murfreesboro. You were in the park at Murfreesboro, worked at the military park at Stones River, and Franklin. And because of that, Tennessee takes a big place because there are big battles fought there. Kentucky, as you can see here, has been bypassed because of the size of the conflict in Tennessee and ultimately Mississippi and Georgia and Virginia. And so we were considered kind of a support system for it, a backwater. We were invaded once, which resulted in the invader Confederate army being turned back, headed back to Tennessee. But aside from that one invasion in September, October 1862, culminating at the Battle of Perryville, there really was no other major conflict here. Battle, I'm talking about. So it has just, it's been relegated to kind of the backwater of the Western theater. And that's sad. But nevertheless, you can see why it happened, and it's only human that it would happen.
Sure.
And it's up to us, I think, across all of us who love this stuff and are interested in it, to do whatever we can to make sure people see it, go there, understand it, because what Kentucky did in this war was important to the war.
Oh, my goodness.
And
absolutely. More and more I see that, and I really see this is kind of frontline understanding of the complexities of the war in so many different ways. And heck, we talk about, when, we talk to students and things like that, like what was Kentucky or what were the border states, like people can name the border states. Can we really talk about what happened in the border states?
Yeah.
Like this is intense, and dramatic and complicated and in many ways tragic.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. It's really our mission to connect people to these sites and stories.
Right. Well, I want to tell everyone who has been patient and listening to us today that to take yourself and your family and come to Lexington. If you live here, then join the rest of this entourage and drive south on US 27 past Nicholasville and visit Camp Nelson. And your visit, I would encourage you to get out, go to the museum, go to the reconstructed barracks, and to the White House that you see there, which was the headquarters of General Speed Fry, and then walk around. There are places, routes marked out for you to take hikes along all the earthworks and gun emplacements around Camp Nelson that were built by African Americans, and take yourself back in time to just the sheer size of the African Americans, the population there, who went into these regiments of United States colored troops and served in Western Virginia, and then served in Grant's army that ultimately wound up at Appomattox. It is a stunning story, and it's something we should all be proud of, how the perseverance, what these people went through in order to make this happen. They're worthy of our respect beyond all measure. So I hope all of you do. And to my friend Steve, I want to thank you for being with us. This is only the first time now. You've got some other repeats to do.
Yeah, we're just getting started. You're right. And I'll say just real quickly, it's humbling being at this site and learning about these stories, both triumphant and tragic. And I would mention that at the moment, this is February of 2021, the buildings are closed, but the site remains open to visitation, the trails, and as Kenton was saying, go out and walk and bring your dog with you on your leash and just walk around, and there's waysides out there. You can really learn about this site, and hopefully in the coming weeks and months, we'll slowly start to reopen, do more programming and things like that. And, we can learn about the Civil War. We don't have to learn about George Meade and the things he did at Gettysburg. We can learn about Ambrose Burnside, the former commander of the Army of Potomac, and the things he did out here. So I had to throw that in there, my friend.
I got it. Gee, thank you so much for being with us. And for those of you out there, you'll be able to listen to this podcast on Witnessing History Education Foundation website, which is witnessinghistory.org. And you will also be able to listen to it on the Witnessing History Education Foundation YouTube channel. And they will be posted within the next few days. So thank you for tuning in, and thanks again, Steve, for joining us.
Thank you. It was a wonderful experience, and I look forward to being back.
You bet.
Become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org. Download our documentaries and free teacher education materials that conform to grade-level education standards at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn.